afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on sociology of kinship, in today's lecture we are going to discuss an important concept of familiar and kinship relation that is termed as intimacy. Now before we go into the understanding of intimacy, what we need to understand is why do we need to comprehend or why is intimacy important, and here the reference is to kind of refer back to the sociological traditions in which we see the dichotomies of the public versus private, in which there was kind of a distinction between the two domains. In one we put economy, polity, which was referred as more significant or to the public domain, and the other side was kinship relations, sexuality, intimacy, familial relationship. Now as we kind of progress in the discourse of knowledge, we see that the two domains are not opposed to each other. There is a kind of continuous interconnection, and that is why it is important to understand the embeddedness. We cannot any longer kind of think about grand theorization in terms of macro level analysis, but we need to, as sociologists, understand the meaning and symbols of everyday interaction. And within the realm of everyday sociology, the understanding of intimacy becomes very significant. And we see that in the recent year, a number of Western scholars have started researching on the concept of intimacy. The term intimacy is today a driving force behind the set of societal shift known as globalization. So the understanding is that intimacy is not to be excluded in terms of only individual relationship which happens within the sphere of kinship, within the sphere of familial relationship, but it is widely connected to the larger economic political force which has been termed as globalization. And we see that as the forces of globalization kind of changes, that it becomes important to understand the way in which we understand intimacy and even understand the changes which has taken place. In this lecture, I am going to specifically refer to one work which is Lynn Jamison, and in her article Intimacy as a Concept, explaining social change in the context of globalization or another form of ethnocentrism. Here, the author explores the concept of intimacy and its relationship to social change in the context of globalization and ethnocentrism. The idea why she wanted to investigate the term is to understand whether the term suffers from an Euro-North American ethnocentrism. So here we see two important concepts. One is globalization, which refers to a large scale exchange of information, economic exchange, political exchange, where the world is living on a global platform. And then we have the second concept, which is ethnocentrism, where there is a kind of inclination to consider one's culture, one's norms, one belief as superior to the other. So the whole idea of the theorization of intimacy by a Western European centric idea was to kind of consider it as a kind of a model type, and it was kind of absent from other non-Western society. So this is where it is going to bring in the cultural specificity of this term. So the author critically examines its dynamic against the background of globalization and potentially ethnocentric perspective. The central questions he possesses is whether our understanding of intimacy is culturally bound, particularly within the Western framework, and how this affects our interpretation of societal transformation. Now, from the sociological discourse, this raises an important question. Do we understand norms, practices, everyday life from a taken for granted Western model or Western perspective, or do we kind of arrive at a micro level understanding at the level of culture, at the level of particular society in which it is practiced? Jamison argues that intimacy, often portrayed as universal and timeless aspect of human interaction, is in fact deeply embedded with cultural norms and values. So, the whole also questioning the grand assumption or grand theorization with which the discipline of sociology started, that there are certain things of universal phenomena, there are certain facts which are to be found in all society, but then when kind of move forward with symbolic interactionism, with ethnomethodology, the cultural specificity of every norms and values becomes significant. So, it is within this framework that Lynn Jamison is trying to understand the concept of intimacy. She suggests that the way intimacy is conceptualized and practiced can vary significantly across different societies, and that this diversity is often overlooked in discussions on globalization. Within the context of globalization, Jamison questions whether the process of global integration and interconnectedness are leading to homogenization of intimate practices worldwide, or if they are instead amplifying cultural differences. She investigates how global flows of people, ideas, and informations are reshaping intimate relationship and challenging traditional norms and boundaries. So, the both objectivity is kind of coming out in her analysis is to try to understand whether there is one way of conceptualizing intimacy, and second is how is intimacy in itself being influenced by the forces of large scale global interaction, and whether there is a kind of dominance of a hegemonic mode of familial relation, or there is a space for existence of multiple cultural practices. If we look into what actually intimacy is implying, here the author says that there is no kind of universal understanding. In simple terms, intimacy refers to the quality of close connection between people and the process of building this quality. So, how close you can be connected. Now, this connection can not necessarily be on your family relation or kinship relationship. This connections can go beyond it, and therefore, what is significant is connection and how this connection is kind of built on and kind of sustained for a longer period of time. So, intimate relations are a type of personal relationship that are subjectively experienced and also socially recognized as close. So, again going back to the larger discourse, that what is personal or what an individual personality is not only his or her biology or his or her way of looking at the reality, it is also the result of the influence of the context in which the individual is placed. So, the quality of closeness can be emotional and cognitive, being of like mind and special to each other. Now, when we try to understand the intimacy as a concept, Lynn Jamison refers to the idea of family practices and tries to understand whether intimacy is something similar to family practices or is it kind of exclusive. Now, the term practices of intimacy is built on the concept of family practices, which was developed by sociologist David Morgan. Family practices encompass the everyday action that family members undertake with the intention of affecting one another. Now, family is also not an institution out there, which is kind of not to be considered as static, but it is a process. And how is it a process? It is in terms of the practices that members of the family are in interaction with each other. So, these practices can range from simple conversation to more complex interaction. Essentially, family practices and family relationship engage in a complex improvised dance where action speaks louder than words. The concept of family practices was developed to avoid preconceived definition of family and instead focus on the culturally and historical variable practices people use to do family, to create an experience of particular place, relationship and event, as mean and expressing family. So, here the entire way in which family as an institution was understood is being negated. So, we just kind of again argue that it consists of members who are kind of fulfilling some functions like procreation and economic needs, but it is beyond that. It is kind of constructed, it is a cultural construct. And how is this construction happening? It is happening through the practices in terms of conversation, in terms of some kind of dependency, some kind of care that each member kind of takes of the other member, and also in terms of the close relationship which is developing. So, practices of intimacy refer to practices which enable, generate and sustain a subjective sense of closeness and being attuned and special to each other. Practice of intimacy and family practices overlap in culture which valorize families and intimacy and take it for granted that intimacy is an aspect of family life. So, much of theorization of intimacy kind of gets invisible because the focus is to understand family and the practices happening, and it is kind of considered as a subset of the family. Therefore, not much theorization on the practice of intimacy has taken place in social sciences. Intimacy as a concept, however, complements rather than supplants terms which seek to categorize such types of personal relationship such as family, friends and kin, and overlap with other concepts seeking to capture the quality of relationship and the process that bind people together like love. So, they are kind of many a time there is a kind of understanding to not directly understand intimacy, but to look into through a indirect lens by looking into the other more comfortable terms like family, friends and kin, and also kind of being questioned that if you are trying to understand intimate relations like love, then it is kind of something which is more personal, which is more subjective in feeling. However, here Lynn Jameson says that this individual or this personal feeling of subjectivity is also kind of embedded in the wider social economic process. So, in everyday English language use in Euro-North American culture, the phrase nearest and dearest often alternates with friends and family to signal key intimate and personal relationship. So, the moment we try to do this, the dearest and the nearest is kind of create a dichotomy between the commercial, the professional, and where does the one takes the nearest and dearest to, the loci changes. So, the nearest and the dearest is to be found in familial relationship, and commercial or professionals are to found in the economic or the public domain. However, what is useful is to understand or to question the idea that how important are these concepts of intimacy and practices of intimacy outside of these culture. So, if we take it outside of a specific particular say European culture and try to understand in a non-Western society, does it become an important concept to understand social change? So, therefore, we try to understand the idea in which the concept of intimacy has been kind of shadowed with the concept of individualism. And now this individualism was something which was coming from the Western society. So, we call it as a Western individual. So, to what extent is this conceptualization of intimacy dependent on a construction of the individual, which is peculiarity of Western form of personhood and subjectivity? Western cultures have a long history of conceptualizing persons as autonomous individuals who are proprietors of their own person. So, whenever kind of we look into literature, sociological literature on social change, the comparison was in terms of the Western and the non-Western society, where Western society was characterized as having the characteristics of individualism. That is, they are more concerned about their own individual need, their own individual choice, their occupation, and this was kind of compared to the collective or the community life of the non-Western society, where the individual would kind of be less significant and the collective, the society was kind of more important. Now, that is the reason why the understanding of intimacy as being part of your individual self, your subjectivity, is again attached to the Western society. So, the author says that in the case of England, Macfarlane argued that this goes back at least to the 13th century, although other scholars stress what is said in later centuries. So, if we kind of look into the idea from where in history do we trace the coexistence or the colliding of intimacy and Western individualism, there is a lot of kind of debate and contestation. Now, after trying to understand the concept of intimacy, let us look into how this concept has been taken care or has been discussed in the sociological tradition. So, within the North American social science have generally taken the view that a cultural emphasis on the sanctity of the individual coexist with the social fact of interdependence between individual. So, in the sociological tradition, when we go back to the emergence of the discipline, you always kind of placed the debate between individual and society. So, you can argue that there were a number of thinkers who were talking about individual society, individuals in the society, and the other kind were looking from the other side, that is the significance of society. So, Durkheim was kind of emphasizing on the collective. So, therefore, whereas when we go into understanding symbolic interactionism, the emphasis is to understand the ways in which meaning and symbol impacts individual life. So, where do we then kind of understand intimacy in sociology? The theoretical traditions of symbolic interactionism and phenomenology, for example, suggest that people are everywhere and always embedded in, reliant on and constructed by the social relationship. Feminist scholars has argued that conceptualization of the individual passed off the history of being proprietor of his own person as if gender neutral. And if we look into the more postmodern thinkers or the more contemporary thinkers, we see there are a number of them who have kind of pointed at the understanding of intimacy as a concept. And to name some of them, Giddens, Bauman, Beck with Begginsem and Castell, they have pointed to a heightened sense of individual identity expressed by practice of self-centered, self-reflective autobiographical narration emerging from the social and economic conditions of global capitalism. Now, again, if we go back to the discourses that was largely coming from European, North American context in terms of large-scale social scientists, they were kind of arriving at this theorization that as society was moving from, say, subsistence based household modes of productions to private property, as capitalism became the more dominant force, the people were kind of shifting from the collective form of social life to individuality. And there is a lot of kind of 70s, 80s, a lot of social scientists are trying to locate this evolution from a collective societal based society to individual and subjective experience of these process. Anthony Giddens linked intimacy and the self. In his view, intimacy is built through a dialogue of mutual self-disclosure between equals, revealing inner qualities and feelings, simultaneously generating a self-reinforcing narration of the self. So, the idea is that and when in kind of Giddens comes into the picture, he is trying to draw a balance between the individual and the collective, and therefore, he is trying to connect the two in terms of being interdependent on each other. The emphasis of individualization as a driver of change in personal life has been comprehensively, persistently challenged. Critiques of the treatment of individualism noted the neglect of evidence, showing the coexistence of intimacy and the valuing of interdependence of kin, gender, generation, and forms of collectivism. Research on Asian culture experiencing significant economic development and growth in consumerism often found young people steering a middle way both adopting practices associated with individualism. And therefore, theories of families on change in the context of India would give us the argument that the married couple were moving out of their family and setting up, say, the new conjugal unit. So, that is how they were kind of the shift from the collective towards individualism was attached to the process of capitalism and economic growth. And that is the reason why the author is trying to establish a connect between intimacy and globalization. And as I already said in the beginning, that these are not from coming in from two dichotomous units, but they are kind of connected to each other. So, if we try to understand what globalization means, it actually implies a restructuring of capitalist market in tandem with social technological system of rapid transport, digitized mass media, mass migration and global social movement. With the structural, economic and political circumstances identified with globalization are not historically unique. So, the use of the term globalization became part of the global mass media talk about social change. So, it was not specifically happening in any one part of the globe, it was something that every society was subject to it. There was kind of an large scale transformation which was taking place in the society, and the major transformation was in the sense of growth of technology, large social media, and it is from these medias, the growth of mass media, where the idea of stereotypical ideas of intimacy, celebrating relationship of individuals equals impacting the imagination across local specific social world. So, global stereotypes do not necessarily erase other idealized notion of intimacy or level diversity in practice in lives as lived. So, anthropologist becomes very significant, and they were mapping the dialectical between new expectation about quality of personal relationship fueled by mass media images of intimacy and conventional arguments as people seek to exercise claims to modernity or more traditional values. So, again there was kind of add on to the dichotomy. One was the whole idea of intimacy versus globalization, and with the mass media kind of portraying a particular mode of practicing intimacy, the intimacy was again attached to being modern as time to kind of considered as a negative value in society where collective or the society was more significant. So, if you were kind of ensuring that your relations are more intimate or you practice intimacy, you were labeled as modern, versus those who were not were kind of considered as more traditional. Another social scientist who becomes very important to understand the concept of intimacy is Manuel Castells. Manuel Castells gave the idea of the network society, and he viewed the global demands of men's authority over women in familial and domestic life deployed both perspectives. So, he is trying to understand that everyone is connected to in some way or the other, and because of the market, because of the global market, because of the media, ideas are kind of moving, are being shared, and therefore a network kind of creates. So, something which was kind of practiced in one particular family in terms of gender violence or patriarchy would soon spread out, and that would kind of bring about a transformation, and therefore the women were kind of using mass media and other realms to bring about change in familial and domestic life, which was again a part of the feminist movement, which was in a large way explained as a connect between the personal and the political. Giddens unequivocally suggested personal life affects social change by spreading democracy through the search for more intimate and equal relationship. Bauman and Beck depicted personal life as the victim of the advancing frontiers of capitalist market. So, when we look into the practices of intimacy, and as we have already discussed, it refers to the practices which accumulatively and in combination enable, create and sustain a sense of close and special quality of a relationship between two people. In a sociological investigation, a repertoire of practices of intimacy has to be derived from research documenting how people conduct themselves within families, parent-child relationship, couple, sexual relationship and friendship, and then there could be even more to it. Any other relationship that has experienced as and socially recognized as having a special quality of close connection. So, it is kind of a more broader spectrum than kind of limited to domestic and familial relationship. The component practices giving to, sharing with, spending time, knowing, practically caring for, feeling attachment to, expressing affection for are not exclusively about intimacy. That is, each practice tends to produce intimacy but is not a sufficient condition. For example, the close association of sharing a present self involves both spending time with and access to privileged knowledge about a self. But development of any shared sense of being close might be carefully resistant, and the idea of the practice of intimacy may be absent in such a case. The deployment of such practices as spending time and knowing may be recognized as qualitatively different when doing intimacy. For example, in a Euro-North American context, intimacy built through spending time together involves a sense of electing to do so and having taken for granted privilege in access to each other's time, perhaps including certain time of type, example, undivided, quality and on demand. Similarly, access to knowledge goes beyond mutual offering of information to taken for granted privileged access to news, being trusted and knowing each other. So, when we look into the idea of the practice of intimacy, we kind of considers that the family practices kind of includes both innovative behavior and habitual or institutionalized action consistent with pre-existing script. So, what we are actually doing within a familiar relationship, much of them are being passed on to us. That is why it is kind of a pre-existing script. We are socialized in that manner, we have been kind of taught to do in that manner, and there is a kind of very little scope for innovative behavior. And much of the time in kind of changes from culture to culture, if there is too much of innovation in a familial relationship, it is kind of labeled as being violent or being influenced by external outside sources. With respect to family practices, individuals typically come into a set of practices that are already partially shaped by legal prescription, economic constraint and cultural conditions. Legal prescription in the sense that there is a formal code of conduct between the members of the family. So, whether we look into the relation between say a father and the son, there is a kind of a relation of authority. Economic constraints, so it kind of practice of intimacy would differ from say a working class family to say or upper class family. And the most important is cultural conditions. So, the cultural code of conduct would actually influence the family practices and that is why the cultural specificity becomes more significant. Just as family practices might fit with and reproduce conventional script, so too might practices of intimacy. So, we generally do not question, we kind of take on as it is being passed out, and scholars would also argue to think about how heterosexuality is kind of a conventional script which is handed on from one generation to the other, and the possibility of developing intimacies are modified by institutionalized arrangement, recognizing and protecting particular types of personal relationship as legitimate partners, parents and kins. The fact that intimacy is built by practices which are not exclusive about doing intimacy explains the fuzziness of the concept and its potential overlap with related constellation of feeling and predispositions sharing some of the component practice such as trust, empathy and respect. Existing research suggests that element of practices of intimacy can be transposable, that is one practice of intimacy is sometime able to stand for other. making it as if other practices of intimacy were also in. So, when we try to understand the way in which the family practices has been undergoing change, also in terms of the inner, internal upbringing, socialization, learning of norms and culture, but at the same time we see that there is a great importance of the influence of the external factor. How we kind of connect to the relation in a family is equally connected to the idea of social integration, construction of community and social capital. So, this is how the understanding of intimacy helps us to widen our understanding of social change, equality, exclusion and the other related concept. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.